Mississippi did not need another cruel man in a black robe. It already had plenty. What made this one different was how quietly he learned to sell pain. On paper, he was a judge, respectable, church-going, married, a man who shook hands at the courthouse steps and spoke about law and order. Like they were sacred words. His name appeared on plaques and letterheads, printed in clean ink that never showed blood. But inside his courtroom, sentences moved like merchandise. People did not understand it at first. They thought they were unlucky. They thought the judge was simply strict. Mississippi had always been strict with the poor, with the desperate, with people who walked into court already defeated. No one expected mercy. That was how cruelty survived here, hidden inside expectations. The men and women who stood before him rarely had lawyers who fought. Most were farmhands, mill workers, teenagers from broken homes, mothers with unpaid fines. They came in chains or borrowed clothes. They lowered their eyes when his name was announced, and the judge watched them carefully. He had learned early that fear made people obedient. That silence made paperwork easier. That a gavel did not need to be loud if the sentence was heavy enough. A young man once stood there for stealing a tire. A single tire. No violence, no priors. The prosecutor recommended probation. The defense barely spoke. The judge leaned forward, fingers folded, eyes calm. 5 years. The room froze. The young man's knees buckled. His mother cried out before the bailiff silenced her. 5 years for rubber and desperation. No one protested. No one dared. Later, in a small office behind the courtroom, an envelope changed hands. It was not marked. It did not need to be. Cash was folded neatly like respect. The judge did not count it in front of anyone. He never did. He learned long ago that dignity made corruption invisible. This was how it began, not with headlines, not with outrage, but with patterns so subtle they felt like fate. People noticed that certain defendants always walked free, not because they were innocent, because their families had land, or businesses, or connections. They hired lawyers who knew how to knock on the right doors after hours. Others noticed something else. That harsher sentences appeared after private meetings. That fines ballooned without explanation. That probation violations suddenly became prison time. But Mississippi had taught its people a dangerous lesson. Complaining only makes things worse. So they endured. A father named Raymond stood before the judge for missing child support payments. He had lost his job when the mill closed. He explained this in a shaking voice. He begged for time. The judge listened without emotion. 18 months. Raymond's daughter watched him disappear behind steel doors. She grew up visiting prisons instead of playgrounds. Her childhood learned the smell of bleach and metal detectors. Years later, she would remember the judge's face better than her father's. A teenage girl was sent to detention for truancy. Her mother worked double shifts and could not always get her to school. The girl cried in court. She promised to try harder. The judge called it discipline. 6 months? The detention center profited from every occupied bed. The judge knew this. He had toured the facility. He had shaken hands with its operators. They spoke about reform while calculating occupancy rates. Money flowed in quiet loops. Sentences created profit. Profit rewarded severity. The judge told himself stories to sleep at night. He said he was keeping order. He said Mississippi needed strong hands. He said these people would ruin themselves anyway. What he never said aloud was the truth. Harshness sold well. By the time anyone dared to whisper about corruption, the damage was already layered too deep. Lives had bent around his decisions. Some had broken completely. A man named Harold took a plea deal he did not understand. He could not read well. He trusted the system because he had been told to. The judge signed off on a sentence that sent him away for a decade. In prison, Harold aged fast. His hair went gray. His back failed. His wife left. His sons grew into strangers. The judge never thought of Harold again. That was the privilege of power, to forget. But outside the courthouse, memory did not fade so easily. Families kept records. They compared stories. They noticed patterns the law pretended not to see. They counted years stolen and names erased, and slowly something dangerous began to form. Not anger. Anger burns out. Something colder. Patience. The first crack came quietly like everything else. A clerk noticed discrepancies, sentencing notes that did not match transcripts, fine amounts that shifted after hearings ended. She mentioned it once casually to the wrong person. By the next week she was reassigned. The judge smiled at her in the hallway. It was not a cruel smile. It was worse. It was gentle. That was when fear turned into resolve. Because fear could be endured, but contempt could not. Outside the courthouse, a former defendant named Samuel began to speak. He had lost 8 years of his life to a sentence even. Prosecutors later admitted was excessive. He was older now, slower, but his voice carried weight. He did not accuse. He described dates, amounts, outcomes. Others listened. Then they added their own stories. What the judge had never understood was this: cruelty creates witnesses. Not immediately, but inevitably. And witnesses talk to each other. Mississippi had buried many things over the years: violence, injustice, names that never made the paper. But this was different. This was documented suffering, organized memory. When questions finally reached higher offices, the judge laughed them off. He had friends. He had donors. He had years of reputation built on being tough. He underestimated one thing: time, because time does not just age the victims, it ages the guilty. And when the moment comes, it does not ask permission. It brings the past with it, and it makes sure the people who were crushed are standing close enough to be seen. By the time people outside the courthouse began whispering, the judge's courtroom had already become a machine. Not a machine in the sense of efficiency. It was messy, human, full of emotion, but it ran on predictability, and predictability could be exploited. The judge had discovered a simple formula: fear plus opportunity equals obedience. And if obedience could be measured in cash, he would have the wealth to prove it. It started with small cases: a woman arrested for unpaid rent, a teenager caught stealing a loaf of bread. Each sentence was a calculation, each fine a potential profit. The courthouse itself became a marketplace. Lawyers who wished to succeed whispered their fees quietly. Defendants who could pay were offered a light sentence, with the right nod or envelope. The poor, of course, had no choice. Their punishment became an instrument, a blade he could wield with impunity. In the back hallways, the judge maintained a roster, not a legal docket but a ledger. Names, offenses, payments, small sums at first barely noticeable, but the pattern was undeniable. He rewarded those who could pay and punished those who could not. The ledger grew. Each entry was a life bent under the weight of his decision. Each figure in ink was a story erased. Some thought it was luck when the judge made errors. Samuel, a former farmhand who had lost 8 years to a sentence that had never been fair, knew it was deliberate. He had spent years compiling notes, speaking to others who had faced the same injustice. They compared dates, fines, and outcomes. Patterns emerged. The judge favored the wealthy, punished the desperate, and turned the law into a currency of fear. Each sentence was a message. Each message said, "Your life is mine to measure." It wasn't just the poor who suffered. Midway through his tenure, a respected teacher named Eleanor challenged a fine for misreported taxes. She had evidence, witnesses, a clean record. The judge smiled when he heard her defense. He enjoyed the challenge, but when the gavel fell, she was fined twice the amount and threatened with suspension. The courthouse murmured. People noticed, but fear was sticky. It took time to peel away. Behind closed doors, the judge had allies. Bailiffs who looked the other way, clerks who falsified paperwork, prosecutors who timed charges to coincide with vulnerable moments. Each of them received small incentives. They whispered, but they also obeyed. Outside the courthouse, no one could prove anything. Inside, corruption thrived in plain sight. Then came the small revolts. A young man named Thomas refused to take a plea he could not afford. He demanded a trial, confident that the law would favor him. The judge smirked. Thomas's friends were sent out of town, and the trial dragged on. When the verdict finally came, Thomas was sentenced to 5 years, not for the crime but for defiance. He left the courtroom pale and broken, but he remembered every detail, every gesture. He told his family. They told others. One by one, the victims accumulated memory like hidden currency. Letters were exchanged, phone calls made when the roads allowed. A network of the wronged began to form. It was fragile, informal, and mostly verbal. But even a whisper in Mississippi could travel. The courthouse had created its own opposition, slowly, one injustice at a time. Meanwhile, the judge's reputation remained untouchable. He attended church in a pressed suit, shook hands at civic events, smiled for photographs. He donated to local charities, as if his guilt could be absolved with a check. His home was immaculate, his dinner parties immaculate, his smile immaculate. But behind that veneer was a ledger filled with names, fines, payments, and sentences, each entry a life twisted, delayed or destroyed. The turning point came quietly without warning. A clerk named Marjorie noticed discrepancies in sentencing records. At first it seemed minor, a missing fine here, a changed date there. But over weeks patterns emerged. Those who could pay were spared. Those who could not were crushed. The numbers didn't match official transcripts. She mentioned it hesitantly to a senior attorney in the courthouse. That attorney told her to forget it. That was not enough. She persisted. She copied records, made notes, and quietly slipped them to people who could use them. This simple act of courage, invisible, almost insignificant, was the first crack in the wall. The victims, meanwhile, were growing older. Their faces carried lines that traced the courthouse's cruelty. A father, Raymond, had grown thin and hollow. His daughter had become a woman hardened by visits to prison and uncertainty. She had learned early that the law could not be trusted. Samuel, whose 8 years had stolen his youth, now looked at the courthouse and counted the years lost in each shadow. Eleanor, the teacher, had begun speaking at local gatherings, describing her punishment and the patterns she noticed. Each story added weight. Each testimony became evidence of intent. Even children were not spared. A boy whose father had been imprisoned for an unpaid fine grew up understanding that justice was negotiable, that life could be stolen with a signature. He watched as his neighborhood changed, as families bent under silent pressure, and he remembered the judge's face. Calm, precise, indifferent. The judge sensed something shifting. At first he dismissed it. Mississippi was slow to act. His allies were loyal. The ledger, meticulous and private, seemed untouchable. But the seeds of reckoning had been planted. Patterns do not stay hidden forever. Witnesses speak. Documents leak. The truth has a way of catching the arrogant. Then came the subtle signs. A reporter mentioned inconsistencies. A clerk whispered about fines that were inexplicably high. One by one, small pieces of the puzzle began to gather. The judge laughed at first. He had managed expectations for decades. He knew how to charm, intimidate, and manipulate. But with each report, each whisper, the distance between him and the people he had crushed grew smaller. The ledger of lives he thought private began to haunt him. The community, once silent, started connecting dots. Families compared fines, sentences, and personal stories. The judge had underestimated one factor: memory. Victims remembered dates, names, and injustices with precision. They formed a quiet resistance, gathering accounts and evidence. Not for vengeance, but for recognition. To show the world and themselves that their suffering mattered. One night, as the judge reviewed his notes, he realized that his carefully constructed world had fissures. The ledger, which had once been invisible, was no longer secure. Every name he had written could now be traced back. Every envelope, every transaction, every harsh sentence, it could be called into question. He felt a rare sensation, unease. For the first time, the machinery of cruelty seemed fragile. He sensed that something beyond his control was forming. Mississippi summers were long and heavy, the air thick with heat and expectation. Inside the courthouse, the judge maintained his composure as always, but cracks were beginning to show. A ledger of lives, meticulously hidden for decades, had begun to breathe in the hands of those he had crushed. The whispers of the wronged had grown louder, coordinated through letters, church gatherings, and quiet meetings in back rooms. They were not seeking revenge, not yet, but acknowledgement. They were demanding that the weight of stolen years be seen. It started with small disruptions. Clerks who had once been loyal faltered under scrutiny. Some were afraid of what they had signed or copied. The judge noticed hesitation in the way files were presented, in the way witnesses were prepared. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but he saw it. He always saw it. And for the first time he felt a flicker of vulnerability. A former defendant, Harold, had taken it upon himself to compile evidence. 10 years lost to a sentence that had never been fair, coupled with stories from others who had suffered similar fates, gave him the resolve to speak out. He went to the local newspaper, bringing with him documents, letters and testimonies. The editor, initially skeptical, could not ignore the consistency. Patterns leapt off the page: payments, preferential treatment, harsh punishments for the poor, and lighter sentences for those who could pay. Each story aligned like pieces of a puzzle. The judge, oblivious to the growing storm outside his chambers, continued to operate with precision. He presided over hearings, signed fines, and smiled at public events, projecting an image of control. But the ledger, the invisible record of his corruption, had taken on a life of its own. With each story published, each witness interviewed, the community grew more aware of the depth of injustice. People who had once whispered in fear were now whispering in courage. It was Eleanor, the teacher, who first confronted him publicly. She did not storm the courtroom or scream. She spoke at a town hall meeting, her voice steady but filled with the weight of experience. She detailed her own punishment, the threats, the fines, and the pattern she had observed in other cases. The judge sat in the audience, rigid and pale, feeling for the first time the uncomfortable heat of accountability. Eleanor's words were precise, supported by documents and testimonies. The crowd listened, a mixture of shock and recognition spreading through the room. This public acknowledgement was the first true challenge to his authority. The courthouse, once a fortress of power, now felt exposed. People who had been silent for years realized they were not alone. Stories multiplied. Families shared letters, receipts, and witness accounts. The judge's reputation, carefully built over decades, began to crumble under the weight of collective memory. Pressure began to mount on the local legal system. Investigators were called in, reviews initiated, and the judge's decisions were scrutinized in unprecedented detail. Each examination revealed discrepancies, inconsistencies, and evidence of favoritism. The pattern was undeniable. A man had manipulated the law for personal gain, crushing lives and profiting from fear. The courtroom, once his domain of absolute control, now seemed like a cage. The judge attempted to fight back. He called in loyal allies, whispered threats to clerks and prosecutors, and even attempted to sway public opinion through carefully placed letters in the local press. But the tide had shifted. Each attempt to intimidate or manipulate was met with a counter. Witnesses ready with documents, journalists prepared with records, and a community unwilling to be silenced. His power, once absolute, was now contested in every corner of Mississippi. Meanwhile, the victims began organizing themselves more formally. They met quietly, shared strategies, and coordinated their stories. Each testimony was reinforced by evidence, payment records, court transcripts, and personal letters. They understood the stakes. Years had been stolen, futures had been lost. But now, with the law on their side and the community behind them, they had leverage. The turning point came in court, in a case that had initially seemed minor. A young man, facing a harsh sentence for a minor infraction, was represented by one of the organized victims who had become a lawyer. The courtroom was packed with observers, journalists and families of those who had suffered. The judge attempted his usual demeanor, calm, authoritative, untouchable. But the weight of scrutiny, the presence of witnesses, and the knowledge that his ledger of injustice was no longer hidden began to show cracks in his confidence. He called the case. The lawyer presented evidence not just of the minor infraction, but of patterns of corruption that the judge had orchestrated over decades. The audience listened, shocked as documents were presented, showing fines, payments, and sentences disproportionately imposed on the poor while the wealthy walked free. It was the first time the judge faced the systemic evidence of his actions in a formal setting. His usual calm was replaced with tension. His voice, once steady and commanding, faltered under the gaze of a community he had long dismissed. Outside, the media began to report on the unfolding scandal. The community, long silent under Phir, now saw a figure once untouchable exposed. Families who had suffered silently for years found their stories amplified, their memories validated. The judge, once a symbol of authority, now faced the tangible consequences of decades of cruelty. The courtroom, once a place of unquestioned obedience, had transformed into a theater of accountability. The judge's allies faltered, unsure of how to navigate the scrutiny. Clerks and bailiffs, once instruments of his will, began cooperating with investigators. Each revelation chipped away at the veneer of control, and the community's patience, cultivated over years of suffering, turned into resolve. This was the moment the judge had never prepared for, facing the full weight of the people he had crushed. The ledger of lives, once private, now served as the blueprint for his reckoning. Every unfair sentence, every manipulated fine, every coerced payment was now evidence against him. The victims, older and hardened by years of injustice, had become witnesses, organizers, and arbiters of truth. The investigation began quietly, almost imperceptibly, but the impact was inevitable. Mississippi's humid air carried whispers from courthouse to courthouse, from family to family. What had once been invisible, the ledger of sentences, fines and favors, was now a living record, a map of cruelty. The judge had believed his meticulous notes and calculated manipulations were untouchable, but they were now vulnerable, exposed to those who had suffered most and to a public slowly, waking from decades of silence. Harold, whose youth had been stolen by years of arbitrary punishment, had become a meticulous chronicler. He gathered letters, receipts, and statements from others who had endured unjust fines and prison sentences. Eleanor, the teacher whose life had been upended by the judge's greed, assisted, cross-referencing court records and personal accounts. The victims had learned to trust each other after years of isolation. What had started as small murmurs became a coordinated effort, every testimony, every piece of evidence reinforcing the other. The courthouse, once a fortress of fear, now felt fragile. The judge, still unaware of the growing storm, continued to operate with his usual precision. He presided over hearings, issued fines, and smiled at public events. The facade of composure was intact, but subtle signs of strain had begun to show. Clerks hesitated as they prepared documents. Bailiffs looked over their shoulders before performing routine duties. Even the seasoned attorneys who had long navigated his courtroom noticed a shift in the air, the invisible machinery of control was beginning to groan under the weight of scrutiny. The first formal inquiries came through quiet channels. State investigators requested case files and cross-checked them against the judge's personal ledger. They asked questions that could not be dismissed with charm or intimidation. Every small discrepancy was examined, every unusual fine documented. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. The judge had exploited fear and wealth alike, granting leniency to those who could pay and crushing those who could not. For decades, his power had seemed absolute. Now each decision was under a microscope, and the microscope revealed the full extent of his corruption. Public awareness began to grow. Families, once silenced by fear, realized that their stories aligned with those of neighbors and distant relatives. Letters exchanged quietly over years now formed a chain of undeniable evidence. People began attending town meetings, not to protest loudly, but to observe, to bear witness. Even in quiet corners of Mississippi, the community collectively noted the judge's actions, plotting small, precise steps to ensure that the ledger of cruelty could no longer be ignored. Eleanor's public testimony was a turning point. She spoke at a town hall, calm but resolute, detailing the injustices she had suffered, the fines that had been doubled arbitrarily, and the threats that accompanied her attempts to seek fairness. The media, skeptical at first, documented every word, recognizing the broader pattern her story revealed. Families of other victims began attending subsequent meetings, each testimony layering onto the previous, creating a mosaic of systematic abuse. The courthouse, once a space where silence ensured survival, was now a stage for truth. The judge's first attempts to counter the growing scrutiny were subtle, calculated and ultimately ineffective. He summoned clerks and assistants in private meetings, issuing stern warnings and emphasizing loyalty. He sent letters to influential figures in the community, attempting to sway opinion, to remind people of his status, and to suggest that any claims of corruption were exaggerated. But the carefully cultivated network of the wronged proved resilient. Each attempt at intimidation was met with greater transparency. Documents leaked, testimonies recorded, and patterns highlighted by those who had lived through his sentences. Courtroom proceedings began to shift in tone and intensity. A minor case, one that the judge had expected to handle with routine efficiency, became the center of attention. A young defendant, facing an unusually harsh sentence for a minor infraction, was represented by an attorney who had worked closely with victims' networks. Evidence was meticulously presented, not only of the current case, but of decades-long patterns of injustice. Documents showed fines disproportionately imposed, sentences extended without cause, and favors granted to those with means. The courtroom gasped as the ledger of past actions was laid bare, revealing a man who had weaponized law for personal gain. Even the judge's allies began to waver. Clerks who had once copied false entries without hesitation hesitated now, fearful of their own complicity being exposed. Bailiffs who had enforced his harsh sentences quietly aligned themselves with investigators, recognizing that truth was an unstoppable force. Each act of cooperation by former enablers strengthened the position of the victims, and each moment of hesitation eroded the judge's authority. Outside the courthouse, the public became an active observer. Families who had endured years of silent suffering now followed hearings closely. Their stories, previously dismissed as anecdotal, were validated by the growing body of evidence. The local press documented the proceedings with meticulous detail, juxtaposing ledger entries against testimonies to highlight patterns of corruption. Even those who had long been indifferent or fearful began to recognize the gravity of the judge's misdeeds. Inside, the judge felt a creeping sense of unease. For the first time, charm and intimidation failed to dominate the room. His once commanding presence wavered. Words that would previously have silenced witnesses were now met with confidence, precision, and corroboration. The ledger, once his private instrument of power, had become evidence of his own unraveling. Every transaction, every coerced payment, every arbitrary sentence was now a testament to years of cruelty. The psychological weight on the judge increased. Days of sleepless nights followed as he reviewed his own records, anticipating inquiries, questioning his decisions, and calculating how much damage could be mitigated. The social isolation he had cultivated as a form of control now turned inward. Allies distanced themselves, fearful of exposure, leaving him with the stark reality of accountability. He had believed that fear alone would protect him. Now, it seemed insufficient against collective memory, patience, and evidence. Victims' testimonies became more detailed and emotionally charged. Samuel recounted the 8 years he had lost, explaining the impact on his family, his work, and his health. Raymond described the toll on his daughter, whose life had been interrupted and shaped by the arbitrary punishments imposed upon him, Eleanor explained how her teaching career had been jeopardized and how she had spent years navigating threats that had no legal basis. These personal accounts, interwoven with documentary evidence, created a narrative impossible to ignore. The judge's attempts at public relations were increasingly ineffective. Letters, speeches, and minor charitable donations could not obscure the pattern of abuse now visible to all. Social and legal pressure converged, and even his once loyal supporters recognized that continued defense of his actions carried risk. The tide had shifted, and the courthouse, which had once been a symbol of absolute authority, now represented the fragility of unchecked power. As more hearings unfolded, the magnitude of the judge's corruption became undeniable. Investigators identified systemic abuses across multiple cases, demonstrating a deliberate pattern of punishment designed to extract wealth and enforce obedience. Families who had been silenced for generations were now witnesses to a process that validated their suffering. Community engagement, media scrutiny, and formal investigations combined to create a force the judge could neither intimidate nor charm away. Every day the weight of past misdeeds pressed upon him. The ledger of cruelty, once a secret tool of control, had transformed into a record of accountability. The public, once distant and fearful, now observed every detail. The judge, who had believed in the invincibility of authority, was learning that patience, documentation, and collective memory could dismantle even the most carefully constructed empire of Phir. Through these days of hearings and scrutiny, it became clear that the consequences he had long avoided were no longer hypothetical. Each testimony, each document, each public acknowledgement was a step closer to accountability. The community, long silent, had organized in subtle, persistent ways, ensuring that the ledger of cruelty could no longer remain private. Mississippi had witnessed decades of injustice, but now finally the system, combined with the persistence of the wronged, was creating a reckoning. The judge's authority, once absolute, was under siege, not by violence or rebellion, but by the relentless force of truth, memory, and patient preparation. For the first time, the judge faced not just the legal system, but the people whose lives he had altered irreparably. The long years of cruelty, once invisible, were now fully visible. He realized that charm, intimidation, and secrecy were insufficient defenses. The empire he had built on fear and manipulation was beginning to crumble under the scrutiny of those he had underestimated. The courthouse, once a sanctuary of control for the judge, now felt like a theater of exposure. Every step he took echoed with the weight of decades of injustice. Clerks who had once moved silently under his command now hesitated at the threshold of every room. Bailiffs glanced nervously at one another, aware that even their routine obedience could become evidence. The very structure he had relied on to project invincibility now seemed to mock him, its walls lined with the whispers of those he had crushed. Public hearings grew longer, more intense. Families arrived early, occupying every available seat, their faces etched with years of fear and determination. The media documented each moment meticulously. The ledger of cruelty, fines extracted, sentences extended, favors exchanged for money, was now displayed before the world. Each page turned revealed another act of manipulation, another life disrupted. And as witnesses spoke, the judge felt the full force of his legacy pressing down on him. Samuel was the first to speak on that fateful day. His voice, steady but filled with decades of contained anger, detailed the 8 years of his life stolen through arbitrary sentencing. He spoke not only of the prison walls and fines, but of the personal toll, lost opportunities, the erosion of family bonds, and the physical and emotional scars that lingered long after he had been released. Each word landed with weight, a calculated blow that the judge could neither deflect nor charm away. Eleanor followed, recounting the ways her professional and personal life had been derailed. She described how she had been forced to abandon projects, pay excessive fines, and endure threats that no law should have tolerated. Her testimony was backed by letters, receipts, and official documents meticulously cross-referenced to reveal patterns of abuse. The audience listened in silence, absorbing not only the facts but the lived reality of a system exploited for personal gain. Even younger voices emerged. A man whose father had been imprisoned for minor debts described the way his childhood had been overshadowed by fear and instability. He spoke of nights spent worrying about his father, of education delayed, of a family fractured by the judge's arbitrary power. These accounts, layered with the evidence of documents and eyewitness testimony, created a narrative that could not be ignored. The judge's power, built on fear and secrecy, was crumbling before his eyes. The judge attempted to interject, to assert control with calm words and practiced gestures, but the courtroom had shifted. Journalists recorded every nuance, every hesitation. Clerks who once would have faltered at a whispered command now watched quietly, noting inconsistencies and errors. The audience, no longer passive, leaned forward with anticipation. Each attempt by the judge to manipulate perception was countered by testimony, by documentation, by collective memory. One particularly damning sequence involved fines imposed on families who could not pay. Receipts and ledgers were presented side by side, revealing deliberate patterns. Those who offered bribes or favors were excused. Those who could not were sentenced harshly. It was clear that justice had never been blind in this courthouse. It had always been transactional. The judge's calm demeanor began to fray. Small gestures into tightened jaw, a hand gripping the lectern, betrayed the realization that his empire of fear was no longer invincible. The momentum shifted further when former allies began to testify. Clerks, bailiffs, and even minor attorneys revealed details of manipulation and coercion. They spoke of meetings where loyalty was demanded, of instructions to alter records, of explicit guidance to impose harsher sentences on those unable to pay. These testimonies carried weight precisely because they came from people who had once been instruments of his power. Each word added to the inexorable collapse of the narrative he had so carefully constructed. The media coverage amplified the effect. Articles appeared detailing specific cases, juxtaposing victims' experiences with ledger entries and official records. Headlines framed the story as a systemic abuse of power, a man who had turned law into currency, crushing generations of families for personal gain. Social pressure intensified. Community members who had been passive observers began contacting witnesses, corroborating evidence, and ensuring that no story was overlooked. Amid this storm, the judge became increasingly isolated. Friends and allies avoided him, fearing implication. Local officials who had once deferred to his authority began expressing concern, demanding transparency, and questioning decisions previously unquestioned. The courthouse, a place he had dominated, now felt like a trap. Every step, every glance, every whisper threatened to be recorded, documented and weaponized against him. Victims coordinated more systematically. Meetings were held in back rooms, in churches, in private homes. Strategies were discussed not for revenge, but for justice. Each person knew their testimony mattered. Each document was a piece of evidence, and every corroborating story strengthened the case. Together, they transformed years of individual suffering into a collective force the judge could no longer suppress. One particularly emotional moment came when a widow recounted how her husband had died in prison after being sentenced for an unpaid minor debt. Her story, accompanied by letters, receipts, and court documents, illustrated the human cost of the judge's system. She described her loss in stark terms, refusing to soften the cruelty he had inflicted. The courtroom, filled with observers, journalists, and other victims, absorbed the story in stunned silence. The judge could feel the weight of every gaze, every unspoken accusation pressing against him. The judge's attempts at defense became increasingly desperate. He tried to call on his status, his experience, and his relationships with powerful figures. He sought to discredit witnesses, to paint them as biased or untrustworthy. But the overwhelming convergence of documentation, testimony and public scrutiny made such tactics futile. Every argument was met with counter-evidence. Every accusation of bias was met with corroboration from other victims. His strategies, once effective, now faltered under relentless pressure. The courtroom atmosphere grew tense, almost unbearable. Families of victims leaned forward, eyes locked on the man who had caused decades of suffering. Journalists recorded every nuance. Investigators observed, noting not only the facts presented, but the judge's increasingly visible anxiety. The judge, who had long relied on fear to enforce control, now experienced the weight of collective memory and patience. His power, once absolute, was slipping away in real time. Even his allies, those who had once followed orders without question, now hesitated in his presence. Some refused to testify, citing fear. Others chose to speak, revealing hidden details of coercion, manipulation, and bribery. The balance of authority shifted. The judge, once untouchable, now faced a court, a media, and a community determined to see justice done. The ledger that had symbolized his control had transformed into a tool of reckoning, each entry a testament to a life disrupted. By the end of the day, the judge sat in silence, confronted not by violence but by accountability itself. The courthouse, the city, and the media were all aligned in scrutiny. Victims, families, and observers understood the breadth of his actions, and no charm, no intimidation, no private ledger could shield him. For the first time, the empire of fear he had cultivated for decades was undeniably vulnerable. Unraveling under the persistent force of truth, the courthouse had transformed. Once a place where fear ruled, it was now a stage of accountability, its walls echoing decades of silenced voices. The judge, who had built an empire on intimidation, bribes, and favoritism, now sat facing the culmination of years of patient documentation, memory, and courage. The ledger that had been his private instrument of control was now the key evidence in dismantling him. Every page, every line, every transaction told a story of cruelty and corruption. The first witness of the day was Samuel, whose life had been stolen by 8 years of arbitrary sentencing. He spoke with measured intensity, recounting each lost opportunity, each strained relationship, and the physical and emotional scars inflicted by the judge's decisions. His testimony was accompanied by letters, receipts, and court documents meticulously compiled over years. The courtroom was silent. The weight of his words pressed on everyone present, including the man who had once wielded absolute power. Eleanor followed, her voice calm but resolute. She detailed the systemic abuse she had endured, fines imposed without justification, threats designed to silence, and professional setbacks caused by the judge's actions. Each piece of evidence she presented connected with others, forming an unbroken chain of proof. Her documentation included official records, personal correspondence, and witness statements that illustrated a deliberate pattern of favoritism for the wealthy and punishment for the powerless. The audience absorbed every detail, the collective gasp of recognition rippling through the room. The young man whose father had been imprisoned for minor debts recounted his childhood shadowed by fear and uncertainty. He described the anxiety of waiting for news of his father's sentence, the impact on his education, and the long-term consequences of the judge's decisions on his family. His testimony, raw and precise, highlighted the multi-generational impact of systemic cruelty. Every observer understood that the consequences extended far beyond individual victims. They had shaped entire lives, communities, and futures. Investigators presented the ledger itself, highlighting fines that had been doubled arbitrarily, sentences that had been manipulated, and favors granted to those who could pay. Each entry was cross-referenced with official court documents and corroborated by multiple witnesses. The clarity of the evidence left little room for denial. The judge, who had once smiled confidently at similar scrutiny, now sat tense, his hands occasionally trembling as the weight of exposure pressed down. Former allies, clerks, and bailiffs testified as well. They spoke of meetings where loyalty was demanded, instructions to alter records, and explicit guidance to impose harsher sentences on those unable to pay. These revelations were devastating precisely because they came from people who had once been instruments of the judge's power. Their honesty, motivated by conscience and fear of legal repercussions, dismantled the remaining walls of protection he had relied on for decades. The media amplified every moment. Newspapers ran detailed accounts of hearings, highlighting patterns of abuse, personal testimonies and ledger entries. Television broadcasts showed the emotional reactions of families, their faces lined with years of hardship and quiet resilience. Public attention grew, and Mississippi began to confront not just one man's corruption, but the broader implications of unchecked authority. The judge's carefully cultivated image of fairness and integrity crumbled under the combined pressure of documentation, testimony, and public scrutiny. During breaks in proceedings, the judge attempted to strategize, reaching out to former allies and influential contacts. His efforts were largely futile. Those who had once obeyed him feared implication in the mounting evidence, and those he hoped to sway recognized that the momentum was unstoppable. He had relied on fear as a shield for decades, but now fear itself had turned against him, as witnesses, investigators, and the community united to ensure accountability. A particularly damning testimony came from a widow whose husband had died in prison after being sentenced for a minor unpaid fine. She described the immediate and lasting consequences of his death: emotional trauma, financial strain, and the erosion of her family's stability. Her story, corroborated with documents and other witness accounts, highlighted the human cost of systemic abuse. The courtroom fell silent as she concluded, the weight of her suffering hanging heavily in the air. The judge attempted to interject, to defend himself, to assert authority with practiced gestures, but each move was countered with evidence. Every objection, every explanation was met with meticulous documentation and corroborated testimony. For the first time, the man who had ruled through fear realized that words alone could not erase decades of cruelty. His authority, once absolute, was now shattered by transparency and truth. The court proceedings extended late into the day, each witness layering the narrative of injustice further. Families, victims, and observers absorbed the cumulative impact of the judge's actions. The magnitude of the corruption, systematically imposed over decades, was now undeniable. It was not merely a matter of poor judgment or isolated incidents. It was a deliberate and calculated exploitation of power for personal gain. As the hearings progressed, the judge's demeanor shifted from composed authority to visible anxiety. His voice, once commanding and unshakable, faltered. Subtle gestures betrayed unease, a hand gripping the podium too tightly, eyes darting toward documents he had hoped remained unnoticed. For the first time, he felt the personal weight of every life he had affected, every family destabilized, every childhood stolen. The ledger of cruelty was no longer a private tool of power. It had become a blueprint for justice. The final testimonies brought the emotional intensity to its peak. Victims recounted the cascading effects of sentences and fines, not only on themselves but on their families and communities. Patterns of abuse documented meticulously over years illustrated the deliberate exploitation of fear, poverty, and systemic vulnerability. The courtroom, once a place where the judge dictated outcomes with impunity, had become a theater of truth. Every observer, every journalist, every family member understood the magnitude of injustice. In the end, the judge faced the ultimate consequences. State authorities imposed formal legal penalties, removal from the bench, fines and charges reflecting decades of abuse. His public reputation, carefully curated for decades, was destroyed. The community, long silent under fear, now witnessed accountability in action. Those he had crushed were finally recognized not as statistics or names in a ledger, but as living witnesses whose patience and courage had overturned a legacy of oppression. The victim's closure was subtle but profound. Samuel reclaimed a sense of dignity lost over years of arbitrary imprisonment. Eleanor saw her professional and personal reputation validated by the court's recognition of systemic abuse. Families once silenced now shared stories openly, ensuring that their suffering would not be forgotten. Across Mississippi, the acknowledgement of wrongdoing reverberated, a reminder that no empire of fear, no matter how meticulously constructed, can withstand the patient, persistent force of truth. The courthouse, once a symbol of absolute authority and cruelty, had been transformed into a monument of justice, achieved through persistence, courage, and the careful gathering of evidence. The judge, who had sold harsh sentences for cash, confronted the full measure of the lives he had disrupted. For decades he had evaded scrutiny, relied on fear, and manipulated law to his advantage. Now he faced the human and legal consequences of every decision, every ledger entry, every act of cruelty. In the final days of proceedings, he walked the courthouse halls with a quiet, heavy resignation. There were no grand gestures of defiance, no charm or intimidation to mask guilt. His empire, built over decades, had collapsed under the combined weight of memory, evidence, and unyielding persistence. Victims, their families, and the broader community witnessed not only justice but the enduring lesson that abuse, no matter how carefully concealed, leaves traces that time cannot erase. Mississippi remembered. The community, once silent under the shadow of fear, now held a collective understanding of what had been done and what had been rectified. The ledger of cruelty, once a secret instrument of control, had become a record of accountability. The judge, whose life had revolved around exploitation and intimidation, now faced the undeniable consequences of his actions. And for those whose lives had been shaped by his decisions, the long-awaited acknowledgement of truth provided a sense of closure, a testament to the power of patience, evidence, and unwavering courage